proverb, I am because we are, is the foundation of the ACBN YouTube channel. Tap in for all of our remarkable content and ecosystem mobilization through the phenomenal practitioners and thought leaders we engage on this channel. In the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, things are not getting worse, they are getting uncovered. We must hold each other tight to pull back the veil. Get ready for another amazing ACBN-powered interview.
Yes, so greetings, my beloved brother Graham Singh. It's good to see you as always, my friend.
Oh, it's so great to see you, Brother Victor, and just be thinking about all of our collaborators all across the ecosystem and across the world. So what a joy and privilege. Thank you.
Indeed.
And Brother Victor, please may I join you in that acknowledgement of who's gone before us in this particular subject. As we look at faith communities, this has that additional dimension, doesn't it? Where there are so many people who care deeply about their faith or who are wrestling with their faith. And these issues of decolonization and particularly land, as we're going to get into, they have a particular meaning, and there's a particular opportunity to do the work of decolonization and reconciliation through thinking about this. So I acknowledge that further, and by way of introduction, our family left India in the 1850s for what was then called British Guyana, in a story mixed, as you know, with African slaves and Indian indentured laborers, which is a whole story on its own, a big story at the heart of Caribbean culture. And then my father eventually, thanks to the Ford Foundation, was able to study medicine, and his father before him had studied law through colonial privilege for brown-skinned people, if we put it that way. And out of that privilege, my father became a physician and ended up coming to Canada, where he met my mother, and who comes from Scottish background. And I was eventually produced in the Guelph, Ontario, in Canada, and grew up with great favor and privilege there. And from there, ended up studying at Western, and then eventually the London School of Economics. And I went back, Victor, as you know, to study this story of colonization in my own family. And that led me to London School of Economics and eventually to working in advertising, as well as finding faith as an adult, my Christian faith. And that was in the context of the Church of England, which is the national denomination in the UK, looking at closed churches and what had happened. By that point, they had closed thousands, and there was a new team set up called the Closed Churches Team, and I was recruited into that. So for some people who, when they find out I'm a reverend, then they think this guy is not really a normal reverend. And I don't even know what that means, but certainly I was never recruited to being a normal reverend in the first place. This was already a slightly unusual team. And it's out of the blessing of that experience that eventually I met my wife, and we had two of our kids in the UK, and then we moved back to Canada to set up something like the Closed Churches Team that I had been part of. And that's where it brings us to Canada, where I began to see this is a very different place. It's even a different place than the country I'd grown up in, because I had grown up while I was over in the UK. And so it was really rediscovering Canada, eventually moving to Quebec, which was an entirely different and remains an entirely different discovery. I've never been more of a minority than when I lived in Quebec, and living as a minority in Quebec is a beautiful thing, and understanding the beautiful culture here. And as part of that gets us to today. We decided that, and by we, I mean all the people I had met across Canada, who I was asking the question, what are we going to do with all these empty churches? A group of us got together and created a new registered charity called the Trinity Centers Foundation. And I'll pause there, Victor, because that kind of brings us to today to say, what are we going to do with these properties? What should we do? What happened to get there? What tools are we going to need to solve what kind of problem? That's the heart of what we do, what I do.
No, that's incredible, and a perfect segue. I was reading the research reports that spoke to like the $500 billion in Christian real estate across Turtle Island in North America. And when you think about these properties and these assets across asset classes, there's definitely an opportunity. There's promise and there's perils. And I'm thankful that a man of your leadership, integrity, and brilliance is at the helm of the Trinity Centers Foundation. Can you give us a little bit of the mission and vision of the Trinity Centers Foundation?
So our mission really and vision is looking at a redeployment of particularly Canada's underused and transitioning faith properties. So that's where we're looking, and our work, our actual mission to get there is looking at leading that change, brokering that change, and really operating and seeing what that will be. So it's looking at all aspects of the transition of faith properties. And we're doing that together with those from the social sector and those who've been what we would call excluded from religious narratives. And we could get into that a bit further, as well as those who are on the inside. That's the bishops and the charities, if we look at it that way. And that's our big beneficiaries of this work, as you know, Victor, are the nonprofits and charities who need space in an urban environment. And by urban, I mean cities, towns, and villages, as well as the unhoused, because really what we're looking at is one of two outcomes when we look at a property. Either keeping the building and fixing it up and using it as much as we can, or the property is being developed, and very often that development will include housing for those who have no house.
That's incredible. One of the things that we noticed as we were doing some work around social innovation and faith communities was just the need for, obviously, justice, access, inclusion, diversity, and equity. But I would love to get from your perspective that the intersection between social innovation and faith communities right now in 2023, and what are some of the promising practices and communities of practice that you're aware of?
Much of our work within those communities of practice comes around the question of place. And there are phrases like place-based investing. And the problem with religious communities entering that space is that put it this way, the largest non-state owner of property in the world is the Roman Catholic Church. So if you add other Christian religions and then other faiths there, religious communities taken as a whole are a huge landowner globally. The challenge is, and we sometimes say this, that religious models, particularly in the Christian church, we see this also in the Jewish faith particularly, and to some extent for Muslims around the world, we're seeing a once in 500 year operating system revolution. And along with that revolution, we see a very different use of land. Let me put it to you in the simplest possible way. A church that's meeting together on a Sunday morning and having some midweek activities, the Ladies Guild meeting to prepare food for the poor and working to support the vulnerable because they themselves are not working. That is a picture from before the Second World War. Think of how much has changed since that time, right? People do not adhere to one religious group simply because of birth. We don't have those of different genders. And of course, gender itself, we've understood so much more about what's been going on there. We don't have just half of a kind of traditional family not working in the church, volunteering. We don't have the mandate to be providing those social services from a religious context anymore. And so those properties are simply no longer used for what they used to be used for. At the same time, many of those services, let's call them, or those parts of the way society is put together, they have been devolved through a whole network of nonprofits and charities, many of whom left with their vision, but did not leave with their property. They became tenants in those properties. So you take an example of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. These 12-step programs are an absolute lifeline for those who are dealing with addiction. And everybody knows where AA meets. It meets in the church basement, right? And it pays very little money in rent. So in terms of the stakeholder groups, all of them are, we would find, revolving around that reality, that the faith communities have taken up a huge amount of the oxygen and the square footage of urban land. And so anybody who's looking to stabilize a nonprofit or a charity or any good community work in an urban environment is somebody that we're talking to and thinking about. So I'm meeting later on today with the global head of property strategy for YMCA. Those are the kinds of conversations that were happening. Certainly with Imagine Canada and Philanthropic Foundations of Canada. We're meeting actually again later today with United Way Canada and Community Foundations of Canada. These are all organizations like SETSI that are working to bring these conversations up of how are we going to restructure the social sector. And those communities of practice, in a sense, we're willing to bring this message and this conversation anywhere where we're invited.
That's a brilliant segue. And once again, I appreciate you being so candid and articulate in terms of really sharing with our community, our viewers and listeners, the work that's being done on the ground. So I give thanks for your thought leadership and the fact that you're also a practitioner. So with that being said,
so much.
In terms of your work in impact investing, and where impact investing landscape is right now internationally and domestically in Canada, once again, what are some of the promises and perils for faith communities as we engage in this work?
Let's take that one from the point of view, let's say, of an executive director of a local charity, a local nonprofit that says, I see this work in front of me. Our work is so necessary. We're good at doing our work. We have an amazing team, but I can't grow this team when I'm applying for grants every single year. I can't attract people in and say, please don't take this job in that insurance company. Come here and work with us because we have this track record that you can do fruitful work and build your family and work with us for the next 10 years. Has said very few executive directors at a local level ever, right? This is a sustainability of financing challenge for those working with the most vulnerable. So when those people, those social purpose organization leaders, hear about this promise of social finance, they think, you mean I might be able to tell the story of the long-term impact of what we're doing? And we might be able to bring those finances in now in order to produce those outcomes? Okay, this is very exciting now. And so we begin the journey of taking existing social purpose organizations who are grant dependent, and let's name the colonial problem with this. The foundations and indeed the government agencies that are distributing those funds, they're very much operating in the same white power, old system way that we're also trying to dismantle, right? The idea of going cap in hand, please sir, may I have some more, in order to pay my staff who are solving society's hardest problem, it hurts, right? It hurts at a local level. So this journey now begins, okay? Now, there's another journey over here, which is from traditional finance, where those foundations, they've been investing in the stock market. And those who are helping them invest in the stock market feel they're part of the mission too, because they're making a lot of money in the markets, and then there's more to be able to grant. So for them, they see the markets are good so that the granting can happen. And that's not wrong, right? The challenge is when we say to those investing in a traditional way, what would it be like to invest in these same organizations that we're going to grant to? And I find this conversation, we're right in the middle of it right now, where people are saying things like ESG and impact investing, and then some of them hope we don't really mean it. Because it's just so much easier to make money investing in a company whose purpose is to make money, right? That's the easiest way to make money. The problem is if that money is also destroying the planet and destroying communities, you take I won't name one, but take an example of a fizzy drinks company, right? A sugary fizzy drinks company. We all know, and I won't necessarily rope you into this, Brother Victor, but I'll speak on behalf of middle-aged men everywhere. Your caloric intake is something you're just fighting more and more as each passing year goes on. Drinking sugary drinks is never going to be good for a middle-aged man, and probably wasn't good for the child either. It's probably the #1 cause of diabetes, which is probably one of the most costly parts of our health system. We're extracting water, we're putting out plastic. So yeah, that company may make a lot of profit, but look at the harm. And of course, as you know, Sir Ronald Cohen with the Impact Weighted Accounts Project from Harvard Business School is looking exactly at this kind of level of analysis. So yes, we can make profit, but we're also causing harm. What would happen if we're also making profit, but creating impact? And this now becomes the question. You say, I think you're going to make less profit if you do that, less financial profit. And that's been a bit of a debate. That's something we're not afraid of saying, what if you were to make less financial profit, but the impact was huge? And this is where, as you know, we start talking about things like, what if we created a real estate fund of homeless shelters? Let's go and buy 100 homeless shelters in Canada, stabilize them, 100 food banks. Let's stabilize those, 100 community theaters. Let's put them on their feet, right? 100 youth clubs. Well, we have these properties, but we know those on the ground, they're not stable. And very often they're what we would call Class B or Class C properties, meaning they need the most work, they need the most renovation work going in. And now, what could we do to stabilize those? Now the question becomes, is that a good investment? Sounds like a good impact. Is it a good financial investment? And that's really at the heart of where we are at with this challenge, is trying to harmonize those two, that balance, but looking at the issue of social purpose real estate. And that's our lens into impact investing. Of course, there's so many lenses into impact investing, but that's one where if somebody was to say, what is your number one measurable impact? We would say very simply, it's the reduction in rate of rent from the market rent for the charities and nonprofits who need space. So it's exactly the same way we look at affordable housing, right? You take the market rate of rent, and then you say, we want to reach this kind of target below that market rate of rent for those who need to be housed. We're saying exactly the same argument for nonprofits and charities, that we need to be placed in that urban environment.
That's incredible, incredible work. I would love, as it's a hot pursuit, do you have a case study, ideally from Quebec or Montreal, just because I'm a big fan of the work that's been done in Quebec in terms of really building out the social economy and social finance on an international scale, where a $20 million investment years ago created almost $600 million in economic activity. But do you have a case study or an example you'd like to share around social purpose real estate, or connects to the faith communities, or just in general?
Happy to give you a few examples there, Victor. Just because we landed off on a fund there, let me give you an example of a fund first, and then I can go into a local project just to make sure folks are following along. Example of the fund is a program called Initiative Immobilière Communautaire de Montréal. So it's the Community Real Estate Initiative of Montreal. And the idea there is a group of foundations came together around Centraide, which is United Way, and they said, we would like to create a social purpose real estate fund. And so they began donating into the fund, meaning that the fund would try to recover as much of the money as they could, but if they didn't, effectively, this was money from foundations, and they were able to stretch some of their limits a bit further. They were then approached by a workers' pension fund called the FSTQ. And the pension fund, and this may be interesting to some of our viewers today, as kind as a pension fund would like to be, they have regulations because their primary obligation is towards those who are going to receive the pension. So they have an obligation to make money so that there's enough money to pay that pension. But pension funds are trying to lean in, and we have a number of conversations that you and I are part of on this subject. And in this case, the FSTQ came in and said, we would like to be there, but you need to de-risk foundations. You need to de-risk this investment for us so that it matches our investment criteria. And the foundation said this would be fantastic because we could multiply by 5 that fund. And you just mentioned a multiplier there. I believe that this particular program is going to see a multiplication. There's echoes of the work now happening in Ontario, and there's a program, similar program being extended across all of Quebec. So the point is that by bringing for-profit pension fund investors together with foundations, we created a fund which is now available to, let's go back to that executive director who's saying, I have this vision, I have the team, I have the model, I just need this physical place where I'm located to remain there. Otherwise, this work will fold up. They could apply to that fund and in fact, go on the journey of potentially even acquiring that. So that's one example. The other example, I'll give you 2 other examples actually. Our St. Jack's site in Montreal, we try to make that a good example. So that's an Anglican church where, as many of you know, I also serve as a pastor in the Anglican Church. I'm the pastor of that church, and we had the permission of the bishop to really begin experimenting there. And what we said was, instead of trying to partner with other local charities as tenants, what would happen if we began to partner with them as partners and gave them either an equity type seat at the place, or in fact, what we're moving towards now, a true equity position in that place? First of all, would it be the right thing to do in terms of decolonizing that religious narrative? We believe that it is. Second, is it actually something that could stabilize the financing? Because now if, let's say, a nonprofit circus company is a partner in this place, could they recruit grants from the places that an arts group can get grants from, a refugee group, we have 2 works working with Indigenous vulnerable people in Montreal. We have a youth, very good youth charity that's there. what if all these people became partners? And that's the St. Jack's story. So that's the second example. And the third is a program that we've been running. It's come through its first year now, and it's called the Montreal Roundtable on the Transition of Religious Property. And that's a project funded by one of the large Montreal foundations, who prefers to remain nameless in the way that they're generous, in such a generous way. And what we did is we gathered the province, Ministry of Culture, the city, Mayor's Cabinet, Department of Heritage, and Department of Social Economy, all of the religious groups, the bishops and their designates from Anglican, United, Presbyterian, Catholic, and we invited others. We had the Montreal Jewish Community Foundation join as well, because they also realized transitions are happening with many synagogues in Montreal, and they've also been very generous with us. And then we had some of the other foundations. And I think around the table, if I counted correctly, I think we had about $10 billion worth of foundations around the table. And we looked at the 400 churches in Montreal. We did some studies of the CRA data on how many of those charities are going through multi-year deficits, how many of them have less than 3 years in the bank to cover those deficits. And we worked with the local Association of Community Tables in Montreal. That's every borough has a community table of all of the social sector there. And they gave us a list of 16 priority places of worship that they would like to see released for the work of their members. So this was a round table looking at that. And it was, in a sense, a case study of what we would like to see happen in every city. And we could do that in conjunction with other round tables, like some of them that are run by the Canadian Urban Institute or the National Trust for Canada. It could be that CETSI gets a roundtable program going, or any of our partner collaborators, and we would join with them in saying, let's bring the question of religious property into there. So there's a few examples just from Montreal.
No, those are remarkable examples. In our work at CETSI, we've partnered with some remarkable organizations, the United Church of Canada, EDGE, and others. And one of the things that we identified is just the need for racial justice program and curriculum training. When you mentioned the Anglican Church and the work that they're doing, it always reminds me, my wife is Jamaican, and just the historical context and sometimes the racial reckoning that a lot of times gets put under the rug. So I'd love for you to just articulate potentially any narratives that you're aware of from the past that impact us today, but we may not be aware of when it comes to some of the denominations that we have to interact with.
Well, let's start where it's hardest, Victor, because there's no point avoiding some of these challenges. There are Anglican churches in Kingston, Jamaica, with slave dungeons underneath the church, where a white Anglican church member would attend the church and leave their slaves in this dungeon while they worship God. Now, that's shocking all by itself. What's then even harder to understand is that throughout the journey of emancipation of that system of slavery, 1838, the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, now the journey begins. But somehow on the other end of the journey, those same former descendants of former African slaves in an Afro-Caribbean context now become staunch Anglicans. The same group which has been stripped of, and this is a big difference, as you know, between Afro-Caribbeans and Indo-Caribbeans, right? Which is a tension between those two groups at times. African slaves stripped of their names, their identity, their religion, their dancing, their music, in order to be forced Christianized as part of that British move of slavery. From that point, 1838, we have people like William Wilberforce, John Newton, these kind of characters involved in this story. Now we go to India and say, look, these Indians, they're actually not working for very much. They're very low-cost labor. And in fact, it seems that they're quite effective. So let's bring them over, and they'll now replace the work of the slaves. Well, here's the problem. Instead of paying those who were doing slave labor, those workers then moved largely to cities, and the Indian indentured laborers now move to the rural areas. So in a place like Guyana, these become the sugar workers. The problem is the Indians now get to keep their religions, they keep their dancing, their music, their names, And they're given in the indentured labor system a deal for a piece of land in exchange for several years of work. This is the indentured system. So this now begins and sets up a tension between, and I'll just deal with the Caribbean for a moment, but of course you see the same pattern in South Africa and in East Africa. So at the end of this, you find, so some of my cousins in Guyana are leading the Hindi dancing associations in Guyana. They're going around, you have Punjabi guys blasting Bhangra music, right? In Punjabi, in Guyana. I think, and then you have Uncle Johnson, the elderly gentleman, Afro-Caribbean descended, who if you step 1 foot out of traditional Anglicanism, that guy will wipe you out, right? And now take all of that and bring that here to a place like Canada. And you find that in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Canada, we have largely Afro-Caribbean Anglican churches with people who truly believe deeply in their faith. Yet the question of saying, how can we decolonize something like the Anglican Church, which I've written about on a number of occasions, including in the Anglican Journal, which is our church's own newspaper. What does that mean? Is the descendant of an African slave allowed to love God through the worship of the religion of his oppressor? Is his faith bigger than that? Is God bigger than that? Well, some people would say absolutely yes. Others would say, hell no. We need reformation within that church. And our lens on that would be to say, can we do something about the land? Even if we're figuring out all of the deep faith questions there, those are some of the kinds of questions that we get into.
No, that's remarkably helpful, because these issues aren't going anywhere. There has been a racial reckoning in many institutions. And I think that those that maintain the status quo within institutions are problematic. But those that are willing to disrupt and innovate and create, I think, are those that will lead generations to come. So I give thanks for your candor, transparency, and vulnerability in terms of sharing those narratives. I did want to have a follow-up question specifically around a model that you shared with me recently, windmill microlending. A lot of people don't know about this model. What's fascinating about it was once again the nurse, an African nurse. I'd love for you to share with our listeners and viewers that origin narrative around windmill. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Victor. And for those of you who don't know windmill microfinance, one of my favorite stories, yours as well, I know, Victor, and really one of the best examples of what social finance can be. So the story is, and I apologize if I miss just any small detail in this, but the principle I think remains the same. It was in fact a janitor working in a hospital in the prairies in Canada, and she came across an obstetrician who was delivering a baby. And unfortunately, the obstetrician could not find a nurse and needed a hand delivering the baby. So the obstetrician called the janitor and said, come and help out as quick as you can. And this janitor really did a fantastic job. And the obstetrician said, you are the best janitor helping me deliver a baby that I've ever had. And this is, thank you so much. And the janitor said, well, doctor, in fact, I'm not a janitor primarily. I am myself an obstetrician, but I come from Nigeria and my credentials were not recognized here in Canada. So I'm working this job while I raise money to be recognized here. Now that doctor got together with a number of doctors, the original doctor that is, and raised some funds for that Nigerian doctor to be recognized in Canada. And that's how Windmill Microfinance was born. They've copied that and created loan programs for highly skilled Canadian migrants. Now, there's a beautiful justice to that anyways. There's a poetry to it. There's also an economic benefit to Canada. That person is now working as a doctor in the hospital at a time when we need all kinds of medical staff. They're receiving a higher wage. They're getting involved in housing stock. They're not drawing upon needs for affordable housing or other social supports. Every good thing is happening now for that family because of that recognition. So Windmill Microfinance offers an unsecured loan. It's a debenture from their charity. It's now just over a $20 million fund. They give a very low rate of return to their investors because they've stood up to them and said, we want to offer a very low rate charging out to those highly skilled Canadians, new Canadians that need that. And it's a wonderful example. It's a real leader of what social finance can be in Canada.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I have two more questions. And once again, I just appreciate your leadership in this. Are you familiar with any faith communities that are right now actively facilitating engagements or training of social purpose organizations?
That's a really interesting question. I think faith communities in general are being very careful about continuing the colonial pattern that they either have or are perceived to have been leading. So in some ways, a bishop saying to a social purpose organization, I'm going to come tell you what to do, is something that bishop will generally resist and be very careful about, for all the right reasons, I think. There are groups like CLAL, which is a Jewish group, which is educating Jewish-related or Jewish background community organizations. I would definitely recommend them. And then there are, let me say, the offshoots of faith communities. And many of the best works, I think, in youth work, in urban employment works, in food security, in homelessness, you'll find that they have roots within the faith community, and that those organizations are themselves leading networks, building networks. But from the faith communities themselves, I think there's probably a hesitancy to, to tell people what to do when in some ways the faith communities' own houses are really not in order at this time, both financially as well as, of course, many scandals and issues of that kind. So no, it's a time where I think many faith communities, Brother Victor, are timid, if I may.
That's remarkable. And this is my final question before we go to closing thoughts and call to action. In terms of social purpose real estate space, right now you have our brilliant brother Isaac Olawalafe, you have Infrastructure Institute, you have Monumento, you have all these organizations doing great work and striving to figure out how we can best utilize public land for public good. We have an affordable housing crisis and carnage across the country, an eviction crisis. We have all these crises associated with engaging people. And more importantly, one of the challenges that we face is a lot of times the private stakeholders are outbidding folks that are trying to protect public lands for public good 3-1 sometimes. So when we look at the models of community land, when we look at the models of social purpose real estates, what do you feel the future is? And what role does faith communities play within this future in Canada?
I'm going to try to answer that question quickly, but I'm sure our listeners will understand that we could do a whole session on just your last beautiful question there, Brother Victor. In some ways, let me give you an example. In Ontario, there is legislation provincially when a school is sold. It takes 3 years to sell a school in Ontario. First year, you need to offer the school to the same kind of school as the existing property has. The second year, it's a bit wider, and the third year, again, it's wider again. And after the third year, the property can be sold on the open market. And I see that as very fair, because those different social purpose organizations have an opportunity to bid on that school. The zoning can remain roughly unchanged, and we have a system. If we could have that kind of a system across more social purpose real estate categories like community theaters and shelters, youth clubs, places of faith, then we would have more of an opportunity for the social sector to be able to get in there and bid and bring together their financing. Of course, a property developer has access to rapid deployment funds. And that Initiative Immobilière program I told you about, that's one of its objectives, is to give rapid deployment funds to the social sector. The social sector does not have rapid deployment funds to go and do that. So slowing down the transition of ownership is one intervention. The other is understanding the beautiful opportunity and also some of the limitations of community land trusts. And like many good things, we start talking about it, and then people get excited and they talk about it again, and they could potentially misunderstand some of the limitations. When it comes to community land trusts, the challenge is lending. So let me explain why. If I tell you I'd like to borrow some money and use my property as security, the story goes, if I don't pay back the money, you'll take my property. So how does that work with a community land trust? If we say, we'd like to borrow $100 million to create this project, and if it doesn't work out, what, the lender is supposed to just go away? No, of course not. The lender at that point, again, is going to have to dismantle the community land trust and go from there. So community land trusts are not, orders from an all-powerful king over that land designated as untouchable forever. But it is a way of trying to stabilize social purpose real estate. So those are a couple of interventions, and boy, we'd like to see more. I'll give you one further comment on that. As we look at our own journey with the Trinity Centers Foundation in creating funding structures, what we would like to see ideally is something of a right of first community refusal put in place onto the properties that we touch, so that we could create something just by bringing the right kind of financing in place that would be like that situation I described in Ontario. Wouldn't that be wonderful if foundations said, we would like to be able to provide financing on favorable terms, like they did for Windmill. But one of the things we want to leave behind is that even if that property has to change hands, that it would change hands between other social purpose organizations in continuity. So yeah, there are many, many things under there. And I could go all the way to the biblical concept shared across Christians, Jewish people, and Muslims of Jubilee, where land can be traded, but eventually goes back to its original community owners. And that's a beautiful biblical concept that underpins our work, and something that I think deeply resonates with themes that I hear in government, in foundations, in other non-religious organizations. And these are the kinds of concepts that now's the time for us to be thinking about those.
That's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable, my friend. Thank you so much for your leadership and diligence as always. Do you have any closing thoughts or call to actions for our listeners and our viewers?
Thank you, Brother Victor. I want to say thank you to you for your leadership and your helping me. And there's times where we will talk out in the open, and then there's times where we will call each other and we will learn from each other. And I really appreciate the time you have taken with me to share your perspective. And as I bring up some of those issues of colonial history, I just note and I acknowledge that that can bring pain and upset for many people. It can bring frustration. And I speak a word of blessing and prayer over those folks, that they could find healing as they go through that journey. And as I spoke about that executive director of a nonprofit on the ground, I speak a word of blessing and prayer over that person, because this has not been an easy journey through the pandemic, as many of those organizations have suffered. At the CFC conference recently, I heard that donations overall across Canadian charities have gone down by some 20% since the year 2013. So these journeys are hard. And as much as I'm trying to speak in an organized way of a vision we're trying to take forward, I really acknowledge the hurt, the frustration, the challenges that these issues, and indeed some of the issues we've spoken about today. So a healing balm across all, and more power to those who are doing this work. And I hope we get to learn from them and you also. Thank you, Brother Victor.
Ashe, ashe, ashe. So thank you so much once again. And we close the way we began, by giving thanks to the Almighty, to the original stewards of the various lands that we are on. We acknowledge all our ancestors, all those who said freedom or death. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Graham. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Victor. See you soon.
Indeed.